Hi, this is a short video about the thesis structure. I'm going to go through the different parts of the thesis structure in this short description. The first part of a thesis is the introduction. Then usually there's a theory section. Sometimes the method section can be before the theory section. This is a matter of taste. I normally like the theory section to be first because then we know what it's all about, and the method section is not really so important for the flow of the thesis. After the theory or method section comes a findings section, which is where, if it's a qualitative paper, you present your data, your case. If it's a quantitative paper, this is usually much shorter, presenting the key numbers of your finding. Then we have a discussion section. The discussion section, you revisit your initial ideas, the initial theory, and you relate them to your data. Is it confirmed? Is it the same? Is there a contrast between what you found and what others have found? This is what you discuss. What is the meaning of my findings? And finally, you make a conclusion where you go into what are really the learning point, what are the implications of my thesis, and then you can also discuss some of the limitations. Okay, so the discussion, what is really important to have in discussion? One of the first things that should be stated in the discussion, and I think maybe within the first few lines, is what we can term a relevance criteria. A relevance criteria states why is this actually important in the real world? Why is it important to do this work? Why do we need something like that? It could be, for instance, due to the globalization of the world, this is important to study the internalization of organizations or something like that. It doesn't have to be very long, and of course it's good to have a reference. In any case, it's good to have references in the introduction for several reasons. It's good because you then show that this is something you have from a trustworthy source, but it's also good because in the introduction, you could go back and revisit some of these references and say, well, now I found all these things. How do they relate to my outset, what I thought to have to begin with? An introduction can also contain a short literature review, meaning that you say this is important, but you may also review the literature and say, well, and not a lot of work has been done about it. So I've stated that this is important for the world to know, but it's also something that I cannot really find too much literature on. If you want to do that, this is of course a very good thing if you can do that, but it can be very difficult. So it can include a short literature review stating that your contribution, your thesis is innovative since it's not something you see every day. A good thing in the introduction, if it's well built, is that it leads naturally to the research question. This means that when you get to the research question, the reader sort of feel, well, of course you need to ask this question. Of course you need to ask the question about this. I can really see it's important and there's a need for it. This is why you must ask this question. Then there's a theory section. A theory section can be a section that outlines different theories that are useful for understanding the coming data. A theory is something that explains why things are like they are. The theory section can include very general, sort of old-time theories, basic theories about human behavior. It can also include a literature review. If you choose not to have a literature in the introduction, you can have it in the theory section describing what other people have found in this area. It may even lead to some hypotheses, especially if you are in the area quantitative research, if you're doing statistics, then could be a good idea to pose hypotheses by reviewing literature that found something that's similar to yourself, and then pose ideas that could be tested. If you choose to have different theories in the theory section, it's good to think about a link between them, so you can at least defend or argue for why these theories are all there. So they're not entirely just, randomly picked three theories because I happen to have known them already, but that you actually can make a good argument why are those specific three theories present in my thesis. The method section is where you present the tools you use to collect data. It can have an epistemological stance, Vinskap's theory. This should not be too long, and it should definitely not be some long confession about why you're a social constructivist or critical realist or neo-positivist. It should be something that relates very much to your research. And in general, the method section should be very much something you make your own. It should be clear that this is your method. This is not something you can take from one thesis and put into another thesis. This is specifically yours, and you do that by using a lot of examples describing what you specifically did. It's very important that you sort of show your cards, that you're really honest and have transparency in your method section, that you show how many interviews, how long did they take, where did you do them, who did you talk to. All of these things should be there. If it's a quantitative, the same thing. How did you collect your sample? How many did you get to answer, and what was the response rate? All of these things should be there. But it's very important that you make it yours and state all the problems you had. It's sometimes if you had some serious problem, you can actually turn this some kind of advantage by discussing what went wrong and why did it go wrong and what could have been done differently and what are the implications of what went wrong. It just shows that you have an understanding of the whole process. After the method section, we have the findings section. The findings section, if it's a qualitative paper, this is where we have a case or a narrative. The case or the narrative is, description. It's using quotes and using interpretation, your interpretation of these quotes. It's usually organized in between 3 and 5 headings, just organizing the paper. These headings, they can be based on theory, so that you say, well, there are 4 dimensions of this concept, therefore I have 4 sections to organize my case into these 4 sections. Or it can be based on empirical findings. So, I found 4 different themes in my data, therefore I have 4 headings. So it should not be too many headings. It's also not be too few. So it's good to have, because then they will be too long for the reader to understand it. Then another thing is it's very good to have a good storyline. It should be nice to read. It should be logical flow in the text, so it goes well from point A to point B to point C to point D. You should also use some meta text, some text that summarizes, some text that introduces the findings, so that the reader knows exactly why they're reading stuff, and when they've read it, they're summarized the main points, and so they really understand what was the idea about it. If you have sort of more sort of neo-positivist stance, you can make contribution that later research can test. So you can have maybe ending your section with a proposition. A proposition is very close to hypothesis. It's just something you often do in either conceptual or qualitative work that, for later testing. In a quantitative thesis, the finding section is usually quite small. It's very short, and it provides basic numbers that we need to know. Are the hypotheses supported or are they not supported? Then the discussion takes up why and all of these things. But the finding section in quantitative papers is usually quite short. Discussion is an important section, and the reason why it's important is that you sort of look now to see, what did I actually find, and is this something that is important to the field I'm researching? Is it similar to what other people found? Is it similar to something, or is it different? And what could be the reason? Is it because I did it in another country? Is it because I did it in a different type of organization or a group? Or is there other reason for it? Or if it's similar to what other people found, what can we still learn from it? And at this point, you should have references. If there's no references in the discussion, this should be some kind of warning light that you need to go back to the references from the front end of the paper, from the introduction and the theory section, and revisit them and say, well, do we know more now? Do we have found something new? You can, in the discussion, you can also discuss some of the limitation of your thesis in terms of methods. How many interviews did you do? Maybe not enough. If it's a quantitative paper, were you sampling correct? Were your respondents, were that sufficient to do statistical analysis? All of these things, you can have that in discussion. The final section is usually the conclusion, and the conclusion is where you really point out what are the learning points of the thesis. What is it that is important? What can we learn from it? That can be in terms of, maybe you can say, well, the theory is not really so good for understanding my area. So what we can learn from this theory is that maybe that theory doesn't work for Denmark, or maybe this theory doesn't work so well in a virtual team, or that could be a theoretical implication. It doesn't have to have a strong theoretical implication, but at least it should have some practical implication. So you can say, well, now we know that this is a problem. We have now a good pair of glasses to understand the whole situation we've been studying, and now we can start using the hammer to start molding and banging into shape what we should do. Now we really understand what it is that's going on in that organization, and we can suggest what the practitioners they should do to improve the situation. That was that. Thank you.